August 1st, 1192. 80 knights jump into the surf against an army that just swallowed an entire city. Not 800, not 8,000, 80, plus somewhere between 400 and 2,000 crossbowmen. Historians can't agree on the number because what happened next shouldn't have worked either way. Richard the Lionheart looked at enemy banners flying over Jaffa, and instead of retreating, he waded ashore waist deep and charged. Within minutes, an occupying army was in full retreat. How do you break a force that size with no siege equipment, no cavalry advantage, and no element of surprise? The answer is a brutal calculation about speed, psychology, and what Saladin's men feared more than the knights in front of them. But to understand those minutes, you need to understand the days that came before them. Rewind 6 days. Late July 1192. Saladin's army appears outside Jaffa like a shadow spreading across the land. Thousands of soldiers, siege towers, sappers who've spent years learning exactly how Crusader walls break. The garrison inside. A skeleton force. A few hundred men stretched across fortifications built for thousands. Why Jaffa? Why does the most powerful Muslim commander in a generation want this sun-baked port town badly enough to pull forces from half a dozen other fronts? Look at a map. Jaffa sits at the southern hinge of the entire Crusader coastline. It's not just a city, it's a door. Lose Jaffa, and you lose sea access. Lose sea access, and every supply ship, every reinforcement, every dream of holding Jerusalem turns to dust. Saladin doesn't need to assault the holy city. He just needs to take Jaffa. And wait. The siege moves with professional efficiency. Engineers work through the night, undermining walls while archers keep defenders pinned. Saladin has done this before. His men have done this before. They know exactly how long a garrison can hold, exactly when hope starts to crack. July 28th. The outer walls give way. July 29th. Muslim forces pour through the breaches. Street fighting erupts across the city. July 30th. The garrison falls back, block by block, house by house, men dying to buy hours they don't think matter. July 31st. The survivors barricade themselves inside the citadel, the fortified heart of Jaffa. They have food for days, water for a week, hope for less. The commander sends desperate messages north. Richard is 50 miles away with a scattered army. The rest of the Crusader forces are tangled in politics, exhausted from 2 years of a campaign that has delivered nothing but compromise and graves. No one is coming. That's what the garrison believes when they begin negotiating surrender. That's what Saladin's officers believe as they divide the spoils of a city already won. No one is coming, except someone is. Richard receives the message on July 31st, and somewhere behind his eyes, a clock starts ticking. Forget the legend for a moment. Forget the Lionheart mythology. Look at the man. 2 years in this brutal land. 2 years watching his crusade disintegrate. Men lost to disease, desertion, the endless grinding politics of allies who hate each other almost as much as they hate the enemy. He came to take Jerusalem. He's going to leave without it. His kingdom back home is falling apart. His brother John is circling the throne like a vulture. Every day Richard stays in the Holy Land is a day his empire fractures further. He should be sailing home. He should be cutting his losses. But Jaffa is dying, and something in Richard refuses to let it die without him. Here's the problem. Armies are slow. Medieval forces move at the speed of their slowest wagon, their heaviest siege equipment. If Richard marches his full strength south, he arrives in a week, long after the citadel falls and Saladin's defenses harden into something unbreakable. So Richard makes a different choice. 7 galleys, 80 knights, a few hundred crossbowmen, maybe more, maybe less. Chronicles disagree, and, historians argue, But the number doesn't change the insanity of what comes next. He leaves the wagons, abandons the siege towers, strips his force down to men and weapons and speed, and he sails into the dark. 50 miles of black water, oars cutting through the Mediterranean night, men praying or sleeping or staring at nothing, understanding that dawn will bring either glory or death. August 1st, first light. The coast of Jaffa emerges from the haze, and what Richard sees stops every voice on those ships. Enemy banners, snapping in the wind over walls that were Christian days ago. Smoke rising from streets where Muslim forces are already consolidating their victory. His commanders see a battle already lost. The standard calculation is automatic. The city has fallen, the garrison is finished, any assault is suicide. Turn north, regroup, live to fight another day. Richard stares at the shore. He's not looking at the banners. He's counting. Here's what no one else on those ships understands. The citadel hasn't fallen yet. If it had, Saladin's forces would be celebrating in the streets, not still positioned around its walls. The surrender is being negotiated, but it hasn't happened. Which means there's a window, a gap between the city is lost and the garrison is dead. Inside that window, chaos rules. Saladin's army isn't formed for battle. They're scattered across Jaffa, looting, resting, securing positions they already consider won. Sentries are relaxed. Commanders are planning what comes next, not what's happening now. They're not expecting a fight. Why would they be? They've already won. That's the edge. The only edge Richard has. Not numbers. Not equipment. Not surprise in the traditional sense. Speed. Pure, violent, unrelenting speed. If he hits the beach now, this minute, before anyone can think, he's not fighting an army. He's fighting a crowd. A mass of soldiers caught in the psychological no-man's land between victory and vigilance. But if he waits, if he sails north for reinforcements, the citadel surrenders, Saladin consolidates, and the window slams shut forever. The calculation takes seconds. The decision will echo for centuries. A shape appears in the water. A man swimming towards the ships with desperate, ragged strokes. A defender from the citadel who slipped through Muslim lines and threw himself into the sea. He reaches the flagship. Hands pull him aboard, gasping, salt water streaming from his body. The message he carries is 3 words. We still hold. 3 words, that's all, but they change everything. Richard turns to his commanders. The argument is brief and brutal. Every officer on those ships knows the math. Every one of them counsels retreat. Richard listens, then he gives an order that will make history. We attack now. The order ripples across the fleet like a shockwave. We attack now. Not, we prepare to attack. Not, we wait for the rest of the fleet. Now. This minute. With what they have. 80. Knights begin strapping on armor in the cramped bellies of warships. Crossbowmen check their strings, count their bolts. Sailors who signed up for rowing, not combat, find weapons pressed into their hands. And Richard? Richard is already at the prow of his galley, watching the beach. Here's what the chronicles tell us about the next few minutes. They tell us Richard didn't wait for the ships to beach properly. They tell us he was among the first into the water, waist deep, then chest deep, wading toward shore with his crossbow raised. A king, in the surf, leading from the front. Was it bravery? Recklessness? Calculated theater? Yes, all of it, because Richard understood something his commanders didn't. This assault would work only if it was impossible to stop. Only if the momentum never broke. Only if every man on that beach believed, truly believed, that hesitation meant death. And nothing builds that belief like watching your king charge first. Picture the beach through Muslim eyes. You're a soldier in Saladin's army. You've spent 5 days taking this city block by bloody block. Yesterday you watched your friends die in street fighting. This morning you woke up victorious. The Citadel is negotiating surrender. By nightfall, Jaffa will be fully secured. You're thinking about rest, about plunder, about the letters you'll send home. Then someone starts screaming about ships. You look toward the harbor. 7 galleys, maybe 8. Not an invasion fleet, barely a raiding party. Your first thought is confusion. Your second thought is, they can't be serious. Then the men start pouring over the sides. Not in boats, not in orderly waves. They're jumping into the water, wading toward shore. Crossbow bolts already hissing through the air. And at the front, unmistakable in his armor, impossible in his audacity, is Richard, the Lionheart himself. You've heard the stories. Every soldier in this army has heard the stories. The Demon King who fights like 10 men, the Crusader who broke Acre. The warrior even Saladin respects. And he's coming straight at you. This is the psychology Richard is weaponizing. Not just surprise, not just speed. Fear. Saladin's soldiers aren't cowards. They've proven that 100 times over. But courage requires context. It requires formation, leadership, the knowledge that the man beside you will hold his ground. Strip away that context, and courage becomes something fragile. The Crusaders hit the beach in a chaos that looks like madness but functions like a blade. There's no formation to target, no obvious command structure to disrupt, just a wave of armored fury pouring out of the sea. Crossbowmen fan out along the waterline, laying down suppressing fire. The bolts aren't aimed at individuals. They're aimed at space, at movement, at anyone trying to organize a response. Behind that curtain of iron, the knights advance. 80 men, that's all. 80 men against a force that just conquered a city. But those 80 men are moving like they're already dead. Like nothing can stop them because nothing matters except the next step forward. The garrison in the Citadel hears it first. They're in the middle of surrender negotiations when the sounds reach them. Screaming, the clash of metal, crossbow strings singing. The Muslim officers across the table freeze. What is that? By the time anyone understands what's happening, it's already too late to stop it. The Citadel gates open. Not to surrender. To attack. The exhausted defenders who thought they were dead men pour out into streets suddenly filled with chaos. This is the multiplication Richard was counting on. His 80 knights aren't fighting alone. They're the spark that ignites everything. The garrison that was ready to surrender is now fighting with the desperate energy of men who've been handed a second chance at life. And Saladin's forces? They're caught between 2 fires. Crusaders from the beach pushing into the city. Crusaders from the Citadel pushing out. And everywhere, the confusion of an army that went to sleep victorious and woke up under assault. Follow a single knight through these minutes. He's been on that ship all night, listening to oars and prayers. He watched the sun rise over enemy banners. He heard Richard give the order and felt his stomach drop. Now he's in the water, waves pulling at his legs, crossbow bolts screaming overhead. The shore seems impossibly far. His armor drags at every step. Somewhere ahead, men are dying. He reaches the beach, sand under his boots. A Muslim soldier appears in front of him. Young, terrified, sword half raised. The knight doesn't think. Thinking is for later. He swings his weapon and moves forward. Another body. Another step. The world shrinks to a tunnel of violence and noise. He doesn't know if they're winning. He doesn't know if anyone is still behind him. He just knows that stopping means dying. And he's not ready to die. Not today. Not in this bloody surf. So, he keeps moving. The timeline collapses into impressions. Blood in the water, spreading pink across the waves. Screams in 3 languages. French, Arabic, Latin prayers mixed with battle cries. A Crusader banner appears on the beach, planted by hands that are immediately cut down. Another man grabs it, he falls too. A third lifts it higher. Muslim cavalry tries to form a charge, but there's no room. The streets are too narrow, the chaos too thick. Horses rear and panic. Riders who've spent their lives winning from horseback find themselves trapped, vulnerable, targets for crossbow bolts that punch through armor at close range. Richard is everywhere, or seems to be everywhere. The chronicles describe him wading through combat like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. Myth? Probably, at least partly. But myth matters in moments like this. Every Muslim soldier who sees him, or thinks he sees him, carries that fear to the next engagement. Every Crusader who glimpses that crowned helmet fights harder, believing victory is possible because their king refuses to accept defeat. And then, collapse. Not a gradual retreat, not an organized withdrawal, collapse. Saladin's forces break. It happens in minutes. One moment they're an occupying army, thousands strong. The next they're running, pouring out of Jaffa through every gate, every breach, every hole in the walls they created days ago. Why? Because they don't know what's coming next. Think about it from their perspective. Richard just appeared from nowhere with a force that shouldn't exist. He attacked a position that should have been impregnable. He's fighting like the story said he would, like a demon, like something more than human. And if he did this with 7 ships, what happens when the rest of his fleet arrives? That's the fear Richard planted. Not just the knights on the beach, the knights that might be coming. The army that might be just over the horizon. The possibility that this assault is just the beginning. Better to retreat, better to regroup, better to face Richard on ground of their own choosing, with formations intact and fear under control. So they run. The sun climbs toward noon. The sounds of battle fade into something quieter. Groans of the wounded, crackling of fires, the exhausted gasps of men who can't believe they're alive. Richard stands in a street that was enemy territory an hour ago. Jaffa is his. Not secured, not fortified, not safe, but his. 80 knights, a few hundred crossbowmen, minutes of violence so intense that an army shattered like glass. The impossible happened, and everyone who witnessed it, Crusader and Muslim alike, will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how. But Richard isn't celebrating. He's already thinking about what comes next. Because Saladin isn't finished. The army that fled Jaffa is regrouping outside the walls, and when they return, they won't make the same mistakes. The real battle is still coming. The silence after battle is its own kind of violence. Richard walks through streets that were a war zone an hour ago. Bodies everywhere, Muslim, Christian, tangled together in the democracy of death. Smoke rises from buildings torched in the chaos. Somewhere a woman is screaming. Somewhere else, men are already looting. He doesn't stop them. Not yet. Let them have their moment. They've earned it. But his eyes aren't on the dead or the plunder. They're on the walls. The breaches Saladin's sappers created. The gaps where an army poured through once and will pour through again. Because this isn't over. You don't humiliate Saladin and walk away. You don't shatter his army in front of his own men and expect him to accept it. The Sultan is out there right now, beyond the hills, gathering his scattered forces. And when he returns, he won't be surprised. Richard has maybe 2 days, maybe less. 2 days to turn a broken city into something that can survive what's coming. The next 48 hours are a blur of desperate preparation. Every able-bodied man in Jaffa, soldier, sailor, civilian, is pressed into service. They work through the night by torchlight, filling breaches with rubble, reinforcing gates with anything that can stop a charge. Richard is everywhere, hauling stones alongside common soldiers, shouting orders until his voice cracks, sleeping in fragments, minutes stolen between inspections. His commanders urge him to rest. He ignores them. Rest is for men who have enough soldiers to rotate shifts. Rest is for armies that can afford mistakes. Richard has neither. Here's the math that haunts every decision. The relief force, the real army, with cavalry and siege equipment and actual numbers, is still days away. It might arrive tomorrow. It might arrive next week. It might not arrive at all if politics back north spiral further into chaos. Until then, Richard has what he has. 80 knights, battered from the beach assault. Garrison that was negotiating surrender 2 days ago. Crossbowmen with dwindling bolts. Sailors who never trained for siege defense. Maybe 2,000 men total, maybe less. Against Saladin's full strength? Against the army that took this city in 5 days? It's not enough. Everyone knows it's not enough. But Richard keeps working, keeps planning, keeps refusing to acknowledge the mathematics of his own destruction. August 4th. Scouts bring the news everyone expected. Saladin is coming. Not a raiding party, not a probe. The full army, reformed and reinforced, flowing toward Jaffa like a tide that will not be denied. How many? The scouts disagree. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Enough that counting doesn't matter. There are more Muslims on the march than Richard has bolts to shoot. The timing is brutal. Saladin has waited just long enough for Richard to exhaust himself on repairs. Just long enough for hope to flicker before being extinguished. This is what strategic patience looks like. Saladin didn't survive 3 decades of war by being reckless. He let Richard have his moment. Now he's coming to end it. The night before the attack, Richard gathers his officers. The meeting is brief. There's no time for speeches, no room for debate. Richard lays out the position in terms that leave nothing to imagination. The walls won't hold. They're too damaged, too poorly manned. A conventional defense means watching Saladin's forces pour through a dozen breaches, while the garrison spreads thinner and thinner until it snaps. So they won't defend the walls. His officers stare at him. If not the walls, then what? Richard's answer will become legend. They'll meet Saladin in the open. Let that sink in. 2,000 men. Exhausted, outnumbered, outgunned. And Richard wants to abandon the only fortifications they have to fight in open ground against a cavalry army that outnumbers them 10 to 1. It sounds like suicide. It sounds like a king who's lost his mind. But Richard hasn't lost anything. He's calculating. The same brutal calculation that put him in the surf 3 days ago. Here's the logic. Inside the walls, his force is spread across a dozen weak points. Saladin can probe, find the gaps, concentrate force where defenses are thinnest. The city becomes a trap that kills them slowly. But in the open, in a tight formation on ground of their choosing, they become something else entirely. August 5th, before dawn. Richard leads his men outside the walls of Jaffa. The ground he's chosen is flat, open, seemingly suicidal. No natural defenses, no walls to hide behind, just dirt and scrub and the Mediterranean at their backs. But that's exactly what Richard wants. Because he's not planning to hide. He's planning to become immovable. The formation takes shape in the gray, pre-dawn light. And what emerges is something medieval warfare has rarely seen. The hedge of steel. Picture it. Front rank, infantry with spears and lances, weapons braced at an angle, against the ground. Each spear becomes a pike, creating a forest of steel points facing outward. Behind them, shields locked together, forming a wall that protects the men holding those spears. Behind that wall, crossbowmen, working in pairs. This is the key. This is the innovation that will break Saladin's cavalry. Each crossbowman has a partner. One shoots while the other reloads. When the first is empty, the second is ready. When the second fires, the first is already spanning his bow. Continuous fire, not volleys with gaps between. A constant stream of bolts that never stops. And those bolts aren't aimed at men. They're aimed at horses. You have to understand cavalry to understand why this matters. A mounted charge is the most devastating weapon in medieval warfare. Horses at full gallop, armored riders with lances couched, the sheer kinetic force of 1,000 pounds of muscle and steel hitting infantry lines. It shatters formations. It breaks morale. It turns battles in seconds. But horses are animals. They feel pain. They feel fear. A horse will not charge into a wall of spears if it can see those spears clearly. A horse struck by a crossbow bolt will rear, will panic, will throw its rider. And a cavalry charge that loses its horses isn't a charge anymore. It's just men on foot, stumbling in armor designed for riding, suddenly vulnerable. That's what Richard is building, not a fortress. A killing machine designed for one specific purpose, making cavalry charges impossible. Dawn breaks, and with the light comes Saladin's army. They flow over the hills like a dark flood, banners snapping, drums pounding. The sound reaches Richard's men before the sight does. Thousands of hooves, thousands of voices, the rumble of an army that expects to end this today. The Crusaders watch them come. There's nowhere to run. The sea is behind them, Saladin in front, and nothing between except faith and iron. Richard rides along his lines, not hiding behind soldiers, not watching from safety, riding where every man can see him, where his presence turns fear into something harder. The chronicles say he spoke to them. We don't know his exact words, but we know what he needed them to believe. Hold the line. Whatever comes, hold the line. Let the crossbows do their work. Let the spears do their work. Don't break. Don't run. Stand, and we survive. Run, and we die. Simple. Brutal. True. Saladin surveys the Crusader position from a rise overlooking the plain. What he sees should make him smile. A tiny force in open ground, no walls, no cavalry reserve, nothing but men and weapons against the greatest army in the Levant. But Saladin doesn't smile. Because he's seen Richard fight. He's studied the man who broke Acre, who marched the coast road while Muslim forces harassed every step, who somehow, impossibly, took Jaffa back in minutes. And he sees that formation, that tight, disciplined, bristling formation that offers no gaps, no weakness, no obvious point of attack. Saladin knows what Richard is doing. He's making the charge expensive, making every yard of ground cost blood, betting that Saladin's army will break before his line does. It's a bold gamble, a desperate gamble. But Saladin has seen desperate men before. Most of them are dead now. He gives the order. The first wave surges forward. Cavalry, hundreds strong, thundering across the open ground toward Richard's line. Lances lowered, voices raised in battle cries that have echoed across 100 victories. The crossbowmen wait. Richard has drilled this into them. Wait for range, wait for certainty. Don't waste bolts on air. 300 yards. 200. The ground shakes with approaching hooves. 100 yards. Close enough to see faces beneath helmets. Close enough to smell horse sweat on the wind. Loose! The first volley sings across the gap. Horses scream. The front rank of the charge dissolves into chaos. Animals falling, riders thrown. The momentum that was supposed to shatter the Crusader line suddenly tangled in its own wreckage. The second volley follows before the first wave hits the ground. Then the third. Then continuous fire. That terrible, endless rhythm of shoot, reload, shoot that Richard designed for exactly this moment. The charge reaches the spear line, or what's left of it reaches the spear line. Horses that somehow survived the bolts now face a wall of steel points. They rear, they shy, they refuse to impale themselves no matter how hard their riders kick. The impact, when it comes, is nothing like what cavalry is supposed to deliver. Not a shattering blow that breaks infantry apart. A grinding, chaotic melee where horses thrash and die and men fight in the bloody mess of their own failed charge. The line holds. The first wave breaks. Survivors stream back toward their own lines, leaving dead and dying scattered across the plain. And behind the Crusader shields, men who expected to die this morning allow themselves one breath of hope. Saladin watches the first wave retreat. His face betrays nothing. 30 years of war have taught him that battles are not won in single charges. They're won in attrition, in patience, in finding the moment when enemy discipline cracks. He sends the second wave. Fresh cavalry, picking their way through the carnage of the first assault. They've seen what happened to their brothers. They know what waits for them. But they go anyway, because Saladin commands and because surely, that tiny line cannot hold forever. The crossbows sing again. More horses fall. More men die in the dirt between the armies. The second wave crashes against Richard's formation like water against stone, and like water, it breaks and flows backward. The line holds. Third wave. Fourth. Each one weaker than the last as the killing ground between the armies fills with bodies. Each one met by that relentless rhythm of bolts and spears that seems to have no end. How long has it been? An hour? 2? Time loses meaning in combat. There's only the next charge, the next volley, the next moment of survival. And still the line holds. Inside the formation, men are dying. Not many. Not compared to the slaughter they're inflicting. But enough. A crossbowman takes an arrow through the throat. His partner drags him backward and keeps shooting. A spearman's arm gives out. The man behind him steps forward to fill the gap before the line can waver. This is discipline, not courage. Discipline. The mechanical repetition of training so deep it operates without thought. Raise the bow, loose, step back, reload, raise the bow, loose. Richard moves through the formation like a ghost. Wherever the line wavers, he appears. Wherever men start to break, his voice cuts through the chaos. Hold, damn you. They're dying faster than we are. It's true. Every man in that formation can see it's true. The ground in front of them is carpeted with Muslim dead. Horses thrash in their death throes. Riders crawl toward safety with bolts buried in their bodies. But knowing you're winning and feeling like you're winning are different things. Because the charges keep coming. Because the arrows keep falling. Because exhaustion is settling into muscles that have been clenched for hours. How much longer? No one knows. They just keep holding. On the Muslim side, something is shifting. Not retreat, not yet. But hesitation. The kind of pause that spreads through an army when confidence starts to crack. Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad is watching. Saladin's own chronicler, his friend and advisor, the man who will write the history of this war. What he sees disturbs him. The charges are losing force. Men who rode eagerly into the first assault now hang back, letting others take the front. Commanders are arguing, not about strategy, but about who has to lead the next wave into that wall of death. Baha al-Din will write about this later, in words that echo across 8 centuries. The Franks were drawn up in order of battle, their infantry in front, steady as a wall, every foot soldier wearing a thick cassock of felt and a mail shirt so strong that our arrows made no impression on them. Each crossbowman was paired with a companion, one shooting while the other loaded. We saw arrows sticking out of their backs, and yet they showed no signs of distress. This isn't Crusader propaganda. This is the enemy describing what they saw. Men with arrows in their backs, still fighting. A wall that absorbed everything thrown at it and kept killing. The psychology of the charge begins to collapse. Cavalry needs momentum. Not just physical momentum, psychological momentum. The belief that the charge will work, that the enemy will break, that courage and speed will triumph over everything. But Richard's line isn't breaking. It isn't even bending. Every charge costs more than the last and gains nothing. Somewhere in Saladin's army, a calculation is being made. Not consciously. Calculations, like this, never are. It spreads from man to man, company to company, a growing certainty that settles into bones. This isn't working. The charges grow slower, less committed. Riders pull up short, loosing arrows instead of closing to melee range. It's safer, it's smarter. It's also useless against men armored in felt and mail who simply endure the arrows and keep shooting back. The battle becomes a stalemate, but a stalemate favors the defender. Every minute that passes without the line breaking is a minute closer to relief, to nightfall, to survival. And then Richard does something insane. He charges. Not a probing attack, not a feint. Richard and a handful of knights, the chronicles say 17, though the number might be myth, break from the formation and ride straight at Saladin's army. 17 men against thousands. Why? What could possibly justify such a suicidal gesture? But watch what happens. The Muslim line flinches. Not a retreat, not a rout, just a flinch. A moment of hesitation as riders who've been watching that impossible defense suddenly see Richard coming toward them. The Demon King, the one who took Jaffa in minutes, the one whose line has broken every charge for hours. And he's attacking. This is the final psychological blow. All day, Saladin's army has been told they're the attackers. They have the numbers. They have the momentum. They're supposed to be breaking the Crusaders, not the other way around. But the Crusaders won't break. And now they're attacking. The math stops making sense. If Richard can defend with 2,000 men and attack with 17, what does he know that they don't? What reserves are hidden? What trap is being sprung? There's no trap. There are no reserves. It's just Richard gambling everything on one truth he's learned across a lifetime of warfare. Armies don't break when they're outfought. They break when they stop believing they can win. The charge accomplishes nothing tactical. 17 knights can't defeat an army. But they can plant doubt. They can make men who've spent hours dying in futile charges question whether this battle is worth one more drop of blood. Baha al-Din describes what happens next. The Sultan was angered to find that among all his army not one could be found to charge the enemy's line. Not one. The army that conquered Jaffa in 5 days. The army that outnumbers Richard 10-1. The army that should have ended this hours ago. Not one man will charge. Because they've seen what happens to men who charge that line. They've watched friends and brothers die in the dirt, and for what? The Crusaders are still standing, still shooting, still refusing to accept the mathematics of their own defeat. The charges stop. Muslim forces begin to pull back, not in rout. Saladin's army is too professional for that. But the withdrawal is undeniable. Men who came to finish Richard are leaving without finishing anything. The line held. Against everything. Against all. Logic and numbers and expectation. The line held. Evening falls over a battlefield transformed. The plain in front of Richard's position is carpeted with dead. Horses and men tangled together, arrows and bolts jutting from bodies, the reek of blood thick enough to taste. The chronicles claim 700 Muslim casualties, almost none on the Crusader side. Are those numbers accurate? Probably not. Medieval chroniclers exaggerate, always have, always will. But even cutting the figures in half, even assuming the worst propaganda inflation, what happened here defies explanation. A force of 2,000 held against tens of thousands. 80 knights and a few hundred crossbowmen stopped the greatest cavalry army in the world, held them, broke them, made them afraid to charge. Richard doesn't celebrate. He's too exhausted for celebration. They all are. Men who have been fighting since dawn slump against each other, weapons still in hand, too tired to move. But Richard is already thinking ahead. Because holding the line wasn't the goal. The goal was survival. And survival means tomorrow and the day after, and the negotiation that has to come before either army destroys itself completely. Saladin is thinking the same thing. The Sultan has lost nothing strategic today. His army is intact. Jaffa is still vulnerable. He could come back tomorrow and the next day and the day after, grinding Richard down through sheer attrition. But something has shifted. Some calculation in the balance of power has changed. Richard proved something today. Not just that he could fight, everyone knew that. He proved that he couldn't be broken. That no matter the odds, no matter the mathematics, he would find a way to keep standing. That kind of enemy is expensive. That kind of enemy makes every victory cost more than it's worth. Saladin begins to consider alternatives. Messengers begin moving between the camps. Not surrender, not victory. Something more complicated, the recognition that neither side can afford to continue. Richard needs to go home. His kingdom is fracturing without him. Every day in the Holy Land is a day his enemies grow stronger. Saladin needs peace. His army is exhausted. His empire is stretched. He's held Jerusalem against the greatest crusade ever launched, but holding it cost everything. Both men need a way out that doesn't look like defeat. And so, in the bloody aftermath of a battle that shouldn't have been possible, negotiations begin. September 2nd, 1192. 1 month after 80 knights jumped into the surf. 1 month after a line of exhausted men held against an empire. Richard and Saladin never meet face to face. They don't need to. Their representatives have been talking for weeks, hammering out terms in tents pitched between the armies. The Treaty of Jaffa takes shape word by careful word. Here's what the Crusaders get. The coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. A ribbon of land barely wide enough to matter. The ports that keep them connected. To Europe. The foothold they've bled for 3 years to maintain. Here's what they don't get. Jerusalem. The holy city stays in Muslim hands. The goal of the entire crusade, the reason 100,000 men crossed the sea, the reason tens of thousands of them died, remains unachieved. Richard will never see Jerusalem, not as a conqueror, not even as a pilgrim. He reportedly refused to look at it. When his army marched close enough to see the walls, Richard turned away and covered his eyes. If he couldn't take the city, he wouldn't even gaze upon it. Pride? Shame? Heartbreak? All three, probably, and none of it changes the mathematics of the treaty. But here's what the treaty does include. The detail that history sometimes forgets. Christian pilgrims can visit Jerusalem freely, unarmed, peaceful, but free. For 3 years, armies have slaughtered each other over access to holy sites, and now, with ink on parchment, that access is guaranteed without another drop of blood. Saladin honors the agreement. Christian pilgrims flow into Jerusalem by the thousands. They pray at the Holy Sepulchre. They walk the Via Dolorosa. They touch the stones their armies couldn't capture. Is it victory? No. Not the victory the crusade promised, not the triumph the Pope demanded and the kings proclaimed. But it's not defeat either. Richard sails from the Holy Land on October 9th, 1192. He leaves behind a coast secured, a peace negotiated, and a legend that will outlive empires. He leaves behind graves, thousands of them, Christian and Muslim, scattered across battlefields from Acre to Jaffa. He leaves behind the question that still echoes. Was it worth it? The Third Crusade killed somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people. It bankrupted kingdoms. It shattered families across 2 continents. And in the end, it changed the map by a few miles of coastline. History doesn't answer questions like, worth it? History just records what happened and lets the living decide what it means. But those minutes at Jaffa, those specific minutes when everything hung in the balance, what do they mean? Let's strip away the legend. Forget Richard the Lionheart, the myth, the symbol, the figure that grew larger with every retelling. Look at what actually happened. A commander faced an impossible situation. His target was lost. His forces were inadequate. Every calculation said retreat. He attacked anyway. Why? Not because he was brave. Brave men die in stupid charges all the time. Not because he was reckless. Reckless commanders lose armies, and Richard never lost his. He attacked because he saw something his officers didn't. A window, tiny, closing fast, where speed could beat numbers, where psychology could beat mathematics, where the enemy's certainty of victory could become their greatest weakness. The garrison thought they were dead. Saladin's army thought they'd already won. In that gap between despair and complacency, Richard found his edge. The calculation was brutal. Hit them before they can think. Hit them so fast that confusion becomes panic. Make them wonder what else is coming. Make them fear the unknown more than the knights in front of them. It worked. But here's what the legend leaves out. It almost didn't. If the citadel had surrendered an hour earlier, if the swimmer hadn't reached the ships, if a single crossbow volley had fallen short, or a single knight had broken on the beach. The margin between glory and catastrophe was measured in minutes, in heartbeats, in the difference between a garrison holding and a garrison giving up. Richard didn't win because he was invincible. He won because he correctly judged the knife's edge he was standing on, and decided to jump anyway. The defense 3 days later was the same calculation in reverse. Conventional wisdom said, "Hold the walls." Richard looked at broken fortifications and scattered forces and saw a trap. The walls would spread him thin. The walls would let Saladin probe and concentrate and break through wherever the defense was weakest. So he abandoned the walls. He took his army into open ground, suicidal ground, and built something that wasn't a fortress, but functioned like one. A human fortress. A machine made of discipline and crossbow bolts, and the absolute refusal to break. The hedge of steel worked because Richard understood what cavalry needed to succeed. Momentum. Confidence. The psychological certainty that the charge would shatter the enemy. Take away that certainty, and the charge becomes expensive. Make it expensive enough, and even the bravest army starts to hesitate. Richard didn't beat Saladin's numbers. He made the numbers irrelevant. What does this teach us? Not that courage conquers all. Courage fills graves as often as it wins battles. Not that one man can change history. Thousands of men held that line at Jaffa. Thousands of crossbowmen worked those killing rhythms. Richard was the architect, but they were the architecture. What those minutes teach is something simpler and harder. Sometimes the mathematics are wrong. Sometimes the calculation that says impossible is missing a variable, a window, a weakness, a moment where everything solid becomes fluid, and the person who moves first reshapes reality. Most people, most commanders, most leaders, most human beings don't see those moments. They see the math. They see the odds. They make the sensible choice, the defensible choice, the choice that history won't blame them for. Richard saw the window, and he jumped. Saladin died 5 months after the treaty, March 1193. Fever took him in Damascus, surrounded by family and legacy. He was 55 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting for an idea: Islamic unity, defense of the holy places, the expulsion of the Crusader states. He never finished the job. The Crusaders held their coastal strip for another century. Jerusalem changed hands again and again. The wars went on long, after both Richard and Saladin were dust. But Saladin earned something that transcends victory: respect. Even the Crusader chronicles describe him as noble, chivalrous, a worthy enemy. In an age of massacre and brutality, Saladin showed mercy often enough that his enemies remembered it. When Richard fell ill during the campaign, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and snow to cool his fever. When Crusader horses died in the heat, Saladin offered replacements, because a knight without a horse wasn't a fair opponent. These gestures seem strange to modern eyes. War is war. Why show kindness to someone you're trying to kill? But maybe that's the point. Both men understood that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. Richard made it home. Eventually. His journey back to England became its own legend. Shipwrecked, captured, held for ransom by the Duke of Austria in a grudge from the Crusade. His kingdom paid a fortune to free him. He spent his last years fighting wars in France, defending lands that were always slipping away. He died in 1199, a crossbow bolt at a minor siege. The Lionheart, survivor of Jaffa, conqueror of Acre, the king even Saladin respected, brought down by a single shot from a castle wall. He was 41 years old. The siege of Jaffa is a footnote in most histories, not a major battle, not a turning point in the traditional sense, a skirmish at the end of a crusade that failed to achieve its primary objective. But footnotes matter, because without those minutes, the charge through the surf, the line that held, the treaty that followed, the Third Crusade ends differently. Maybe in complete collapse, maybe in a negotiation from total weakness, maybe in another decade of grinding warfare that bleeds both sides dry. Richard's gamble at Jaffa didn't win the war. It saved the possibility of an ending that both sides could survive. Sometimes history turns on footnotes, on a swimmer reaching a ship in time, on a king choosing violence when retreat made sense, on 2,000 men deciding, together, that they would not break. The chronicles remember the glory. The legends remember the Lionheart. But what actually happened, what those minutes actually were, was simpler and more human than any legend. Men faced impossible odds. They calculated, they prepared, they fought. Some of them died. Most of them survived. And when it was over, the world was slightly different than it would have been otherwise. That's all history is, in the end. Minutes that could have gone another way, and didn't.